What happens when a man's darkest secrets unravel and the woman he loves disappears without a trace? Is it a nightmare, or is something far more sinister at play? Stay with us till the end to discover the chilling truth that no one was ever meant to know. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Watch now and prepare for a shocking revelation you'll never forget. It was a quiet evening. The house felt empty. Rachel had been gone for 2 days now. Her phone lay untouched on the kitchen counter. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence. Jason paced back and forth, his hands sweaty. He hadn't told anyone yet. Not his parents, not the police. A cold chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. Rachel had never disappeared like this before. Her things were still here. Her purse, her shoes. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The walls seemed to close in. Jason felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't breathe. The baby. Rachel had been pregnant. They had been so excited. A new chapter. But now she was gone. He remembered the fight they had a week ago. It had been ugly. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. He regretted it all. But he had no idea how things had gotten so bad. Jason sat down on the couch. His mind raced. He kept replaying the argument over and over in his head. But nothing made sense. A sudden knock at the door startled him. His heart skipped a beat. He opened it slowly. Standing there was a woman. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Are you Jason?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied, confused. She handed him a crumpled piece of paper. Jason unfolded it. His breath caught in his throat. It was a note. In Rachel's handwriting. But the words, they didn't make sense. "I'm sorry, Jason. I couldn't go through with it. The truth will come out." What did it mean? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had to find her. But where? The night seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer. Jason stood frozen. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking. And then there was a noise. A faint scratching sound. Like something trying to escape. It came from upstairs. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The sound was faint, but it was there. Scratching. Like fingernails on wood. It echoed in the quiet house. Jason slowly turned toward the stairs. His legs felt heavy. Like lead. He tried to steady his breath. But the fear, it gripped him. Was someone upstairs? Could it be Rachel? His mind raced with dark thoughts. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. Trembling, he walked toward the staircase. The house was unnervingly still. The only sound was his footsteps. Each step felt like it echoed too loud. As he reached the top, he froze. The scratching had stopped. But now there was another sound. A soft, muffled whimper. Jason's stomach turned. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the panic rising inside him. The whimper came again. This time, louder. It was coming from the bedroom. The room Rachel and he had shared. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. He paused. What if it was something worse than he imagined? He didn't know if he could bear it. But he had to know. With a swift motion, he turned the knob. The door creaked open. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the window. And then he saw her. Rachel. But she wasn't alone. She was sitting in the corner. Her eyes wide and wild. Her hair disheveled. And beside her was a man. A man Jason didn't recognize. He stepped forward, confusion mixing with anger. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice trembling. Rachel's eyes locked on him. But there was no recognition. No warmth. Just emptiness. She stared at him like a stranger. The man beside her stood up. His expression was unreadable. Jason felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "Who are you?" Jason demanded. The man said nothing. Rachel let out a soft, eerie laugh. It sent chills down Jason's spine. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The words felt like a knife to his chest. What had happened to her? Why was she here with this man? And why did she look so different? Jason's breath hitched. His legs felt like they were going to give out. What was going on? Rachel's face was pale, her eyes vacant. It wasn't the woman he had married. The man beside her stepped closer, a tall figure with cold, calculating eyes. Jason's pulse quickened. I don't understand, Jason said, his voice shaky. Rachel didn't respond. Her gaze stayed locked on him, but it was distant. The man moved again, positioning himself between Jason and Rachel. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Who are you? He demanded again, his voice rising. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. That's not important, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Jason's gut twisted. Everything inside him screamed to run. But he couldn't leave her. Rachel. Jason shouted, reaching out to her. She flinched, her eyes flashing with fear. But then, something changed. She seemed to snap back to reality for a split second. Her hand trembled, reaching out toward him. I didn't want to, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jason stepped closer, his breath shallow. Rachel, what's happening? Who is he? But before she could answer, the man moved quickly, blocking her from view. Jason froze. The man's eyes were dark, as if he knew something Jason didn't. Something dangerous. You should leave, the man said coldly. Jason didn't know what to do. His mind was spinning, each thought sharper than the last. Something wasn't right. I'm not leaving without her, Jason said, his voice steady, though his insides were unraveling. The man's lips twisted into a dark smirk. Then you'll be in for a surprise. Jason felt the temperature in the room drop. The hairs on his arms stood up. Rachel's eyes flickered again, but this time, they were filled with terror. Jason, don't, she whispered, her voice breaking. The man stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the room. Go, he ordered, his voice thick with malice. Jason took a step back, his instincts screaming at him. But something held him there. A force he couldn't explain. Rachel's face was a mix of fear and regret. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice barely audible. Jason's mind raced. What was happening? Who was this man? And what had Rachel gotten herself into? Jason's chest tightened. His mind screamed for him to run, to get out of the house. But his body refused to move. The man's presence was suffocating. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling. He didn't know what he was up against. The silence between them stretched on, thick and oppressive. Rachel's eyes remained locked on his, full of sorrow, full of fear. Please, Rachel, Jason whispered, stepping forward again. His voice cracked, desperation creeping in. She flinched, shaking her head. No, don't come any closer. Jason's heart sank. He could see the conflict in her eyes. But she wasn't the same. Something had changed. The man took another step, his eyes narrowing, the corners of his lips twitching as if amused. You don't understand, he said, his voice low, almost a warning. Jason's fists clenched. I understand enough. What have you done to her? The man's smirk deepened, dark and cold. I haven't done anything to her, he said. But I'm afraid it's too late for you. Jason's stomach turned. This wasn't just some stranger in their home. This felt orchestrated. Suddenly, a noise broke through the tension. A loud crash from downstairs. Jason's head snapped toward the sound. It was followed by heavy footsteps. Someone was in the house. The man at the door didn't move. Instead, he turned his attention back to Rachel. Jason's heart raced as the footsteps drew nearer. Who else was involved in this? Rachel's voice trembled, her lips barely moving. Get out. Jason, you don't know what you're dealing with. Jason's breath hitched. The words made no sense. But he had to listen. He had to find a way to get her out of here. But as he turned to leave, something stopped him. A shadow crossed the doorway. A figure emerged from the dark. A woman, tall, with striking eyes that glowed eerily in the dim light. Jason's blood ran cold. She looked familiar. She looked like Rachel, but older, more worn. The woman's lips curled into a smile. "Did you think you were the only one?" she asked softly. Jason's mind spun, trying to process what he was seeing. Who was she? What was happening to Rachel? Jason's heart raced. The woman's smile was chilling, a twisted reflection of Rachel's own. He could feel the blood draining from his face. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's eyes gleamed with an unsettling calm. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, her voice oddly familiar. Jason took a step back, his mind reeling. He didn't understand. How could she look so much like Rachel? Her voice, it sounded so much like hers too. But there was something wrong. Something off. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Don't you recognize me, Jason?" she asked again, almost taunting. Jason's mind scrambled. No. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. "Who are you?" he repeated, his voice rising. The woman took another step closer, her eyes locking with his. "I'm the one who's been watching," she said softly. "I've been waiting for this moment." Jason's blood ran cold. The words felt like ice in his veins. What was happening? The woman stepped aside, revealing something behind her. A mirror. It was cracked, jagged lines spiderwebbing through its surface. And there, in the reflection, was Rachel. But it wasn't Rachel. It was her, but not. The image in the mirror was distorted, like a warped version of the woman he loved. Her features twisted, her eyes wide and empty. She was staring at him through the glass, her expression unreadable. Jason's chest tightened. His body felt heavy, as if the air itself was growing thicker, suffocating him. "I tried to protect you," the woman whispered, stepping even closer. "But it's too late now." Jason took another step back, panic rising in his throat. No. "What's happening to her? What did you do to her?" he demanded. The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile. Nothing and everything. The room seemed to close in around him. The walls felt like they were caving in. His mind spun, trying to make sense of it all. But nothing made sense anymore. Rachel's voice cut through the tension. "I'm sorry, Jason. I never meant for this to happen." Her voice sounded hollow, distant. It was as if she was no longer fully there. Jason's heart broke. He reached out to her, but his hand shook as it hovered in the air. The reflection in the mirror flickered, distorting further. And then, with a loud crash, the image shattered. Rachel was gone. The woman smiled again. But it wasn't Rachel. Not anymore. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The mirror shattered into jagged pieces, the glass splintering across the floor. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was deafening. His eyes darted to the empty space where Rachel had been just moments before. She was gone. The woman in front of him stepped back, her smile growing wider, more sinister. "You didn't listen, Jason," she murmured, almost taunting. "But you'll understand soon enough." Jason's chest tightened. He had to get out. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen. The air was thick with tension, the room closing in on him. Rachel's voice echoed in his mind, her desperate apologies swirling in his thoughts. "Why?" he choked out, his voice breaking. The woman tilted her head, as if savoring his confusion. "Because," she said slowly, her eyes glinting in the dim light, "you never truly knew her." Jason felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. This wasn't Rachel. It couldn't be. The woman in front of him was something else entirely. But she had worn her face, her voice. Had Rachel been hiding something? Had she been pretending all along? Jason reached out, his hands trembling. "Where's she?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The woman laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Oh, she's here," she whispered, stepping closer. She's always been here. Jason's eyes widened. What was she saying? The woman's smile faded into something darker, more twisted. Her body, it's still here. But her soul? It's long gone. Jason staggered backward, his mind struggling to comprehend the words. His heart pounded in his chest as a sick realization began to settle over him.
No.
This couldn't be true. But something told him it was. The woman's eyes narrowed, her gaze locking onto his with unnerving intensity. Rachel was never the person you thought she was. She was another version of herself. One you couldn't see. Jason's skin crawled. He couldn't breathe. What was this nightmare? Where is she? He demanded again, his voice almost frantic. The woman took another step toward him, her hand outstretched. You've already lost her, Jason, she whispered. The truth is buried deep. And you're never going to find it. Jason's mind whirled. What truth? Where was Rachel? And who was this woman? The air grew colder, the darkness in the room pressing in on him. He could feel it. The darkness was real. And it was alive. Then, without warning, the woman lunged forward. Jason barely had time to react. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest. His body went cold. Everything blurred. As the world around him faded into darkness, he heard her final words. Welcome to the truth, Jason. And then everything went black. Jason's body went limp. His breath came in shallow gasps as the darkness swallowed him whole. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The pain in his chest radiated out, but it wasn't just physical. It was as if the very essence of him was being torn apart. The coldness around him deepened, wrapping around him like an icy shroud. Everything faded. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No sound. No light. No feeling. Then, a distant voice pierced through the silence. A whisper. Jason. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. It echoed in his mind, faint and fleeting. Jason, you have to wake up. He wanted to scream, to fight against the suffocating dark. But he couldn't. He couldn't find the strength. The voice grew clearer. Please. Jason, don't give up. His eyelids fluttered, heavy as lead. His body refused to respond, but the voice was calling him back. Slowly, with agonizing effort, Jason opened his eyes.
Light.
Blinding light. His body jolted with pain as he gasped for air, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was different. It was sterile.
Cold.
Fluorescent lights buzzed above him. He tried to sit up, but his body was sluggish, weak. He could feel the weight of the pain in his chest, but it was dull now, as though it were far away. Jason, the voice again. This time it was softer, familiar. A hand brushed his arm. He turned his head, and his heart stopped. It was Rachel. But it wasn't the same Rachel he remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. And there was something strange in her expression, something he couldn't quite place. Rachel, he whispered, his voice hoarse. She didn't respond. Her eyes flickered to his, then away, like she was lost in her own world. Jason tried to speak, but his throat felt dry. His hands shook as he reached out toward her, but she stepped back, almost as if she were afraid of him. Where am I? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's eyes hardened, her lips tightening. You're here, she said, her voice distant. You shouldn't have come. Jason's mind raced. He tried to sit up again, but his body felt foreign, as though it didn't belong to him. What happened? He forced out. Rachel looked down at the floor, her gaze distant. I tried to warn you, she murmured. But you wouldn't listen. You never understood. You never saw it. Jason's chest tightened. The words felt like a punch. He looked around, his mind trying to make sense of the place. It was a small, clinical room, sterile and empty. The walls were white, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. What do you mean? Jason croaked. Rachel's eyes flashed, her expression shifting from distant to almost angry. The truth, Jason. The truth was never meant for you. But now you're here. You've seen too much. Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What truth? He whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Rachel's gaze locked with his, her eyes dark, void of emotion. The truth about me. About everything. You never knew who I really was, Jason. And now it's too late. Her voice faltered for a moment, a hint of regret in her eyes. But then it was gone. Jason's world was spinning, every word she spoke unraveling his grip on reality.
No.
No, I don't understand. Where is she? What happened to Rachel? Rachel's lips parted slightly. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, a door in the corner of the room opened. The man, the one who had been with Rachel earlier. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space like a dark shadow. Jason's blood ran cold. His heart raced. I think it's time you understood, Jason, the man said, his voice cold and final. Jason's eyes flickered between Rachel and the man, his mind struggling to piece it all together. But it was impossible. Everything he thought he knew about his wife, about his life, was crumbling, and the truth was still out of reach. The man stepped further into the room, his footsteps echoing ominously in the sterile space. Jason's eyes darted between him and Rachel, a sinking feeling in his chest. Everything felt wrong. The man's cold gaze never wavered, as if he had all the answers. Answers Jason could no longer comprehend. You still don't understand, do you? The man said, his voice low, taunting. Jason's mind was reeling. What was happening? He could feel his pulse racing, blood rushing to his ears. The room seemed to shrink with every passing second. Rachel stood silently, her back against the wall, eyes downcast. Her presence felt distant, like she wasn't really there, or like she was someone else entirely. The man crossed his arms, his cold eyes narrowing. The truth about Rachel is that she's not who you thought she was. Jason's throat went dry. He couldn't breathe. What do you mean? He whispered, his voice barely audible. The man's lips curled into a smirk. Rachel was never the person you fell in love with. She was something else. Something we created. Jason blinked, confusion flooding his mind. Created, he repeated, his voice shaking. What are you talking about? Rachel's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly sharp, filled with something Jason couldn't recognize. She took a step forward, her expression unreadable. The truth is, Jason, she began slowly, her voice steady, I never wanted to hurt you. But this is who I really am. Jason's stomach churned. No, he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. You're not like this. Her eyes were cold. Maybe you should have listened when I tried to warn you, she said, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from another world. Jason's pulse quickened, panic rising within him. This wasn't Rachel. This couldn't be her. The man moved closer, his presence pressing down on Jason like a weight. We've been watching you, Jason, the man said softly. Every step, every moment, Jason's mind raced. Watching him?
Who were they?
And now you've seen too much, the man continued. You know things you were never meant to know. It's too late for you to walk away. Rachel's eyes flickered for a brief moment, an expression of something almost human. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. Jason's breath hitched. What did you do to her? He demanded, his voice breaking. The man smiled darkly. She was never really alive in the way you thought, Jason. She was a vessel, a creation, a copy of something much older. We needed her and she needed us. Jason's head spun. What was he hearing? This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. I don't believe you, Jason said, though his voice trembled. The man's expression darkened. You don't have to believe me. You've seen the truth now. And it's far too late to change anything. Jason felt the walls closing in, suffocating him. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the horror unraveling before him. Rachel stepped forward again, her gaze unblinking. She was close now, so close he could feel the coldness radiating off her. "I'm sorry, Jason," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this for you. But I couldn't stop it." Jason's mind was a storm of confusion. "Stop it," he echoed, his voice a fractured whisper. Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she took one final step forward, and for a moment, Jason could have sworn he saw a flicker of something, some trace of the woman he had loved in her eyes. But it was fleeting.
Gone.
Just like her. The man's voice broke through the silence. "It's over, Jason. You've crossed the line. Now you belong to us." Jason's body went cold. His heart stopped. He was trapped. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against his chest, suffocating him. And in that moment, Jason knew there was no escape. Not for him, not for Rachel, and not for anyone who had ever dared to step too close to the dark truth they had buried for so long. The lights flickered once, then went out. Complete darkness. And then silence. Jason awoke with a violent jolt, his heart racing, gasping for air. The darkness was gone, replaced by a dim light that filtered through a cracked window. The smell of damp earth and rust filled his nose. He was lying on the cold, hard ground. His body was sore, bruised, and disoriented. But the silence around him was absolute. It was like waking up from a nightmare, only to realize it was real. His eyes darted around. He was outside now, but nothing was familiar. There were trees, tall, skeletal things that loomed in the distance. A thick fog clung to the ground, wrapping everything in an eerie haze. The air was cold, damp against his skin. He didn't know where he was, but it felt wrong. His heart pounded louder in his chest. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were stiff. Panic gripped him as his mind scrambled, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the man, the woman who had looked like Rachel, the dark, suffocating room. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? But no. Something told him it wasn't. A crackling sound from the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned his head sharply, every muscle in his body on edge. There, standing in the fog, was Rachel. She stood motionless, her back to him. "Rachel." Jason called, his voice desperate. But she didn't move. Her figure was shadowed, barely visible in the thick fog. And then, as if the air itself shifted, she turned. Her eyes were cold, lifeless. Her lips curled into a smile, familiar but wrong. "Jason," she said, her voice distant, almost flat. "Where have you been?" Jason's stomach twisted. Her voice, her face, was the same, but it felt like everything about her had changed. "Rachel, please, what's going on?" Jason begged, scrambling to his feet. But Rachel took a step back. "Don't you see, Jason?" she whispered, her voice chilling. "It's too late now. You've seen too much." Jason's breath caught in his throat. No, I haven't seen anything. I don't understand." The ground beneath him seemed to tremble. Rachel's eyes darkened, the smile twisting into something far darker. "You understand now. And there's no going back." Jason's body froze as a shadow moved in behind her. The man. The same cold, menacing figure. The one who had orchestrated everything. "I told you it was too late, Jason," the man said, his voice like ice. "You can't undo what's already been set in motion." Jason's world began to crumble. He didn't know what was real anymore. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness. His heart thundered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. "Rachel, please," he begged, his voice cracking. What are you?" Rachel's eyes flickered for a moment, something deep inside her struggling to break through. But it was gone too quickly. The smile returned, cold and hollow. "You should have stayed away, Jason," she whispered. And in that moment, Jason understood. The truth wasn't something he could escape. It wasn't something anyone could escape. The fog grew thicker, the ground shifting beneath him. And then, the darkness swallowed him whole once again. This time, there would be no waking up. Jason's body was heavy, his limbs like lead as the darkness closed in around him. The cold fog seemed to wrap tighter, suffocating him, drawing him deeper into its grip. The man's shadow loomed over him, a presence that filled the air with dread. And Rachel, or the thing that had once been Rachel, stood at the edge of his vision, her eyes cold and unwavering. Jason's breath was ragged. "Why?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to know, but the question forced its way out. The man didn't answer at first, his gaze dark, almost amused. Then, with chilling calm, he spoke. "Because there are things in this world, things you're not meant to understand." Jason's heart pounded, the world around him spinning faster, the fog closing in like a vice. "Why her?" Jason's voice broke as he spoke Rachel's name. The man's smile was cold, cruel. "Rachel wasn't the first," he said softly. "She was just the next. The next in a long line." Jason's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" he gasped. "The truth, Jason, is that everything is a cycle," the man continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "What you thought you knew, it was never real. You were never meant to find out. But now you have. And now, there's no going back." Jason's mind reeled. The words were slipping away from him, tangled in a fog of confusion. He tried to stand, tried to escape, but his body was frozen, his every movement slow and painful. "Why did you do this to us?" Jason's voice was barely a whisper. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light, a flicker of something dark and ancient behind them. "Because some truths are more powerful than love, Jason," he said. "And when the truth is unleashed, it consumes everything." Jason's chest felt like it was caving in. Rachel's face flickered one last time, but her eyes were empty now, no trace of the woman he loved. All that remained was the hollow shell. In that moment, Jason realized there was no escaping this. No running from the truth. No way back. The fog thickened around him, and as the final shadows closed in, the silence claimed him. And in the end, there was only darkness.